Good afternoon. We are going to start our finance meeting for May 14, 2024. Roll call, please.
Yes, we'll start with Committee Member Harmon,
Here.
Vice Chair Friedman,
Here.
Chair Gutierrez.
Here. And then we will move on to our agenda item for today.
Chair Gutierrez, any public comment, general public
I'm
comment?
sorry. Any public general comment? Do we have anybody online?
Chair Gutierrez, no hands are raised.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to agenda item.
Excellent, thank you so much. Good afternoon, members of the Finance Committee. My name is Keith DiMartini, and I am the Finance Director for the City of Santa Barbara, and I am here with two consultants that we have been working with over the past number of months in preparation for the item that is before you today, which is to discuss a proposed ballot measure. So the recommendation that is before the Finance Committee today is to first hear a presentation from staff regarding an update on Vision 2030 and the Fiscal Sustainability Initiative and the need to pursue additional revenue sources to maintain essential city services. The second recommendation is to recommend that the Council introduce and subsequently adopt, by reading of title only, an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara authorizing the imposition of the Santa Barbara Essential Local Services Tax, subject to approval by the electors by the addition of Chapter 4.15 to Title 4 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code. And recommendation 3 is that the Council adopt, by reading of title only, a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara ordering the submission to the qualified electors of the City of Santa Barbara a measure relating to an establishment of a general transaction and use or sales tax at the consolidated general municipal election to be held on November 5th, 2024. The agenda for today's presentation is to first receive an update on efforts related to Vision 2030 and fiscal sustainability. I'll provide a brief overview of the general fund budget outlook. We'll talk about some public opinion polling that has been conducted recently and the results of that polling. We'll also talk about some pretty extensive public outreach initiatives that have been ongoing for many months. We will then talk about the proposed ballot measure and then take questions, public comment, and discussion. So first, I'd like to provide an overview of many efforts around Vision 2030 and fiscal sustainability. Just to remind the committee members of this initiative that was presented a little over a year ago, actually during budget review meetings last year. This was a staff-led effort to really implement best practices in good governance, really looking at ways of improving our services, adopting emerging technology, finding ways of maximizing and optimizing our existing revenue sources, find ways of implementing more efficient services and processes in hopes of reducing costs, becoming a much more sustainable organization, not just from like operational and service delivery perspective, but also financially. We also had a pretty extensive presentation with this committee over a year ago where we talked about many of these goals underneath fiscal sustainability. We do multi-year forecasting, as the committee is aware, and we look out beyond 1 year to try and understand what are some of the implications and challenges we face as an organization to maintain our fiscal sustainability, implement and get approval for a balanced budget. And we're looking at ways of generating revenue and reducing expenses wherever possible. And so this presentation before you today is in line with the goals and objectives of Vision 2030 and long-term fiscal sustainability. One of the multiple working groups that has been established under Vision 2030 is a revenue working group. And I had the pleasure of spearheading and leading this team of dedicated city employees. And we have done quite a lot of work in this area of really trying to understand and really brainstorm any and all options that we can consider as an organization of ways of generating more revenue. And that is looking at generating more revenue from our existing revenue sources and also potentially new revenue sources. We went through a very sort of methodical process to first brainstorm very objectively, no ideas were bad ideas, and then review those options under this evaluative criteria that we established. And then we identified which ones might warrant further discussion, then bring forward for potential implementation. We also, on a separate path, got drafted and got approval by council during last budget cycle, the cost recovery and revenue policy. And that has been implemented now for the better part of a year. And we have been considering fee changes and proposals in line with that policy. We are before you today for Finance Committee review for this potential revenue measure, and that ultimately has to go to council and then ultimately the voters if this goes that far. I also want to remind the committee of the evaluative criteria that the Revenue Working Group used when looking at and evaluating all of those revenue options. There were approximately 70 individual revenue generating ideas that were considered, and we evaluated them pretty thoroughly based on this criteria. How much money could they potentially generate? What are the legal requirements to implement? Some funding sources are restricted for very specific uses. Some are unrestricted, like a general purpose tax measure is unrestricted. What is the longevity of revenue? Is that revenue that might continue in perpetuity? Does it have a sunset? How volatile is that revenue? We have some more volatile revenue sources than others. Some options only require city council approval. Some require voter approval. All of these require some level of resources, whether that's staff time and money, potentially to either implement it and or continue to administer it. And so we looked at all of these criteria to really come up with which ones we would like to present and bring forward. We then plotted the results of that exercise on a graph that looks like this. So we had a weighted score with all of those criteria scored, and then we plotted that against revenue to understand which ones maybe have the least burden to get approved, maybe are very least burdensome on administering going forward, and how much revenue could they generate. And so staff wanted to focus on those revenue generating options that were in that upper right quartile, as you can see on this example listed here. So what we did is we plotted all of the taxes, the tax options on a graph, and it looks like this. And as you can see, sales tax was one that rose up to the top as far as the amount of actual annual revenue it could potentially generate, with some variability, understanding that there is some volatility in our sales tax revenue as council and the committee is aware. And there are many other options that we considered, as you can see here, that fell sort of on the lower area as well. It's also important to note that we have already moved forward with some of these options already. We have already initiated audits for transient occupancy tax and cannabis, and you can see those are two options over there on the bottom right. We have already started to implement that, and others are being considered. You can see short-term rental enforcement audit is also on this list. Council approved of the enforcement pilot program not too long ago, and so that is also an effort underway. Again, the whole purpose and the goal of the Revenue Working Group under Vision 30 is to figure out how to optimize our revenue. There are many ways of doing that, through auditing our existing revenue sources, to auditing other revenue sources that we haven't yet audited, like TOT and cannabis, the short-term rental enforcement program, and also considering future revenue measures as well. So the next section of today's presentation is to give an overview of our general fund. These are slides that I presented to you during our initial budget introduction meeting in April, when the city administrator's budget proposal was released for fiscal year 2025. And this graph shows the output of our multi-year forecast effort, which shows our projected general fund expenditures growing in that top solid red line. And it also shows our revenues growing in the dotted green line, primarily from taxes and other general fund revenue sources. But as you can see, there is a gap between our expenditures and our revenues. We do have a structural deficit, and unfortunately that gap widens in the out years. And so we do have to make some progress on our expenditure growth and our revenue growth as well. And on the right-hand side, you can see some notable impacts as to why our revenue is growing at a slower rate compared to our expenditures, primarily for those expenditures noted below, from salary increases, related pension costs, medical benefits, the impact of inflation, how much it costs for our capital and investment in our infrastructure, and many other considerations as well. This table summarizes our general fund revenues and expenditures over the last couple of years, and then where we are projected to come in at next year in the recommended budget from the city administrator. At this time, we are projecting a $7.1 million deficit. We have more budgeted expenditures than our budgeted revenues. And it's also important to note that we do have a reserve policy to keep in mind in regards to ensuring that we have adequate reserves of 25% in order to sustain our operation through times of economic distress or times of an emergency. So now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Adam Shorensen from FM3 Research, who him and his firm conducted a poll on the attitudes of a local Santa Barbara funding measure, who's going to go through the results of that poll.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, committee members, for having me here. Keith, I think you'll be sharing the slides, is that right? Yeah.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Right now I've got a lot of versions of me on the screen, but can everyone see the slides? Then I won't worry that I don't see them. So, Keith, just to confirm, the folks in the room can't see the slides or not yet?
Yeah, they cannot at the moment. We just need, should we Chair Gutierrez, City TV is working on a technical solution at this time. We could take a short break to make sure that that can get resolved. We're not quite ready yet.
Okay, yeah, let's take a short break while we fix this technical issue.
Thank you so much. We're ready to continue. For our staff or consultants that are online, we are projecting the slideshow, but we're not able to see your video. And so we apologize for that, but you can go ahead and continue, please. Thank you.
Upcoming election. We did 542 survey interviews, which leads to a margin of error of plus or minus basically 4.5. So keep that in mind as you see some of these results. We reached people in a few different ways. We did phone calls with live telephone interviewers. We also sent email and text message invitations for voters to take the survey online, and they could do one or the other. They couldn't take the survey in both formats. The online portion is not like one of the ones that you might see showing up on Facebook or Nextdoor, where the same person could take it 30 times, or you could forward it to your friend and have them take it for you. This is more protected so that we get a good representative sample of the likely voters of the city. We made the survey available in English and Spanish, and you might see something that doesn't quite add up to 100%, and that's because we've rounded decimal points. Okay. So for the next slide, we wanted to show you the language of a potential measure that we tested in the survey. We find that the best way to understand the viability of a measure is to draft a 75-word ballot question of the kind that the city could be putting in front of voters and asking them how they react to it. So this is the measure that we tested in the survey. You can see we're calling it the City of Santa Barbara Essential Local Services Measure in bold. And then there are some illustrative examples of how funding could be used here: 911 emergency, fire, paramedic, police response, fire stations, housing affordability, homelessness, drinking water, stormwater protection, et cetera, including retaining local businesses and jobs, and then an acknowledgement that the measure is a general purpose measure, that it's a half-cent sales tax that would provide approximately $15.6 million annually, in effect until ended by voters. And then we know that there's some fiscal accountability built into all local public funding, audits, public spending disclosure, all the money is going to be used locally. But a lot of voters are not aware of that, so it helps to remind them of that or make them aware of that within the ballot question itself. Could go to the next slide. Here's the response to that ballot question. On the right-hand side, we're showing you the responses from the survey we just completed. On the left, you can see an earlier test we did on a similar but not identical ballot question. If you look at the right, starting there, nearly 6 in 10 voters tell us that they would favor that kind of measure. 35% would oppose it, 6% are undecided, and this measure was structured to be a general purpose measure, meaning you would need a 50% plus one majority in order to pass that measure. Now, as I mentioned, we also did a survey in May of 2023, a little bit earlier in this process. Support was a little bit higher for a measure at that time at 66.29, but as issues related to inflation, cost of living, and a lot of other things continue to swirl, it's a little bit of a harder environment for ballot measures than we saw maybe a year ago. With that said, still almost 10 points above the threshold for passage. Now, in all of the surveys we do, we like to evaluate not just the total vote, but the intensity with which voters hold those opinions. So if they told us yes or no when they read or saw that ballot question, we asked, is that definitely yes or definitely no or probably no? And if their first reaction was to say they're not sure, we ask if they're leaning towards voting yes or leaning towards voting no. So that's the breakdown there, and the different shades of blue and different shades of red. This is not with any more information. This is just based on their initial responses. You can see that the definitely yes is stronger than the definitely no, 30%, 31% to 22%. Right around that 20% is almost always the floor for a definitely no number. You're almost always going to have roughly that many people in a given community who would be likely to strongly oppose any kind of revenue enhancement measure. We could go to the next slide. Just a little bit of a taste of how the support and opposition to this measure breaks down geographically. We looked at this within each council district. We see majorities supporting the measure really across the city, stronger a little bit in District 3 and in District 6, but statistically pretty similar across all 6 council districts. By the way, at the bottom, you see some numbers in parentheses. Those are the expected percentages of the likely voters in each district, which then matches up to the way we developed our survey sample. So for example, in District 1, 12% of the likely voters are in that district. Those voters in District 1 support the measure at a 58 to 35 number. Okay. And then lastly, in terms of, if you go to the next slide, we have a bit of the breakdown by household income for the respondents. And interestingly, we see essentially no difference whether voters are at the lower end of the income span or the higher end. There's support that exceeds 60% really across those figures. And if anything, slightly, although statistically pretty equal, slightly higher support for those voters whose household income is under $50,000. Okay. So I think that's the extent of our survey report at this point. And Keith, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. We'll turn it over to Mr. Rob Krinke, who's going to give an overview of our recent public outreach initiatives.
Thanks, Keith. If we can bring up the slides. So as Keith mentioned, we've been engaging in a pretty robust public information and outreach education program for about the last year. Oh, and I've lost the slide. Okay, here we're back. Included in that has been nearly 24 presentations that we've made to various groups I'll touch on here in a moment. These meetings provided an overview of the city's services, the budget outlook, as well as the potential option of revenue enhancement, such as Keith has outlined earlier in the meeting. The meetings allowed for community members to share their input, ask questions to various city department heads, and give other feedback about both the revenue measure and city services themselves. We can go to the next slide. You can see here examples of these meetings. You'll see that they represent a cross-section of communities throughout the city, business advocacy groups, HOAs, civic groups, as well as senior groups, and a series of public town halls that have been taking place over the last couple of weeks. And I'll note that the preponderance of those town halls actually took place after FM3's poll came out of the field. So we've had some robust outreach even after those results have come in. You go to the next slide. We also set up a resource on the city's website under the banner Essential SB. Essential SB was kind of an umbrella term for our outreach program and provided significant background on not only the city's budget, but on individual city services, public safety, public works, libraries, parks, and others. We create a series of videos with city leadership. You see here an example of Chief Gordon. We had, I think, 8 of these videos in total that really spent a few minutes in depth on these issues, talking about calls for service, the increase in demands for local public services, the cost that goes into maintenance and provision of these services, and what the outlook for these various services are. We also did a piece of direct mail. You could see pictured on the left. It was bilingual. It was done in English and Spanish, and it was distributed about a couple of weeks ago. Next slide. Some examples of our community forums, and you can see here an illustration not only of the events themselves, some of which drew as high as 70 participants, others less so, but we had pretty robust participation throughout our public town halls here in the last month. And we also had an exercise where participants could come up. They were given a slate of 10 different community priorities, and they were each given 4 stickers, 4 dots, and they could affix those to the priorities that they felt were of the highest importance to them, and I'll get into some of those results. So what priorities are important to Santa Barbara community members? What do we hear throughout all of this outreach? Again, we've conducted these public town halls and all told a couple dozen meetings besides that, and have had talked to hundreds of local residents as part of this outreach, and we've heard some specific trends throughout that. If we go to the next slide. Some of the things that we heard back organically from the group. Public safety was a consistent issue in the community meetings, and that may include property crime issues, as well as other kinds of quality of life issues, speeding and such. Homelessness was a consistent question. What is being done? How is the city's count growing, and so forth. Housing comes up very consistently as part of I would say, a broader concern about affordability in the region. The issue of State Street, parking, the state of the businesses on State Street is something that we heard over and over. What revenues could be increased and what other options has the city considered? And Keith, I think, detailed that the city had done a lot of investigation about what other revenue sources could be considered to close the city's deficit. What would be the impact of the new levies on residents and businesses? How would this affect our competitiveness with other communities from a business standpoint, as well as just the impact of another revenue piece on local residents? We were asked about the city's pension liabilities. People asked about impact fees and if those are being properly leveraged to recoup costs for the city and provisioning services and so on. This is not reflective of the totality of what we heard, but reflects, I think, some common themes. You go to the next slide. We also included on the website and in these town halls and in the community meetings opportunities for folks to complete a survey, which again had about 10 or 12 resident priorities on it. This was available in English and Spanish, and we gathered nearly 1,100 responses to that survey over the last year. It was promoted again on the city's website, on social media, e-newsletters, in our public meetings. We provided paper copies at the workshops, as well as other high traffic locations in the city. And we asked folks to rate these issues as high, medium, or low priorities. Next slide. And you see here, we asked about maintaining 911 emergency response services, keeping our public areas safe and clean, protecting local drinking water and ensuring a reliable supply of safe drinking water in the city, preventing thefts and property crimes, addressing homelessness, improving housing affordability, retaining and attracting local businesses and jobs, protecting neighborhoods from hillside fires, maintaining library services for youth and other residents, maintaining programs for local seniors and youth. All things that are supported by the general fund. And in this venue, residents were allowed to pick all of them as a high priority if they choose, or all as a low. And you can see here that people did affix a higher priority to certain issues than others. In this particular instance, it was public safety issues that topped the list, followed by drinking water, and then a couple that are related to affordability and homelessness. If you have the next slide. We also had open-ended responses to these surveys. So again, 1,100 folks giving us, their kind of unvarnished views on what they view as a priority for the city. I put together a word cloud here that gives you a sense of what we're hearing in those remarks: housing, homelessness. Again, you see State Street, business, downtown, the parking issue, which kind of rose to the fore here in the last month or so. This is, I think, a bit of an indication as to what we were hearing in the open-ended responses, and it tracks pretty closely to what we heard volunteered from people who actually participated in the live events. Next slide. And last but not least, our dot game. I showed an illustration earlier where we actually tried the same issues and tried it a different way, where folks could not say that everything is a high priority, but they had to prioritize within those. So they were only given 4 dots for the 10 or 11 issues. And you can see here, housing affordability topped the list, accrued the most dots as part of this exercise across about a half dozen events. That's followed by keeping our public areas safe and clean, addressing homelessness, and then public safety. So when folks can affix equal priority to everything, we actually saw public safety rise a little bit higher. When we forced a choice on that, and follow them, instructed them that they could add to limit the amount of priorities they had, we actually saw the housing affordability outpace that issue a little bit. So is that our last slide, Keith?
Yeah, yes, it is, Rob.
I'll hand it back to Keith.
Thank you very much. So the final section of the presentation today is to talk about what the proposed ballot measure could look like. And so I'd like to read this out loud, and it ties very closely to the ballot, the proposed question that was in the poll. However, there is a little bit of a difference here that I can point out, but it reads as follows. The City of Santa Barbara Essential Local Services Measure shall the measure maintaining 911 emergency fire paramedic police response, keeping neighborhood fire stations open, improving housing affordability, addressing homelessness, keeping public areas, parks safe, clean, maintaining library services, stormwater protection, improving natural disaster preparedness, retaining local businesses' jobs, and for general government use by establishing a half-cent sales tax, providing approximately $15.6 million annually until ended by voters, requiring audits, public spending disclosure, all funds used locally be adopted. So this is, again, very close to the question in the poll. We have included some words here for maintaining library services called out specifically. That was feedback that had come from many of the public outreach events and community feedback that we received. So we did call that out specifically in the question, which again differs from the poll, but it largely is consistent with the question in the poll. There are 2 other documents before you in the packet today. One is the ordinance as one of the recommendation for approval, and that would provide the authority to levy the half-cent tax. It would also require the audit as well. That is in the ordinance. And then there is also the resolution, which would be action taken by council to effectively place the measure on the ballot for November. And then it will also direct the city attorney to prepare the impartial analysis. So again, before you now is the recommendation for the Finance Committee that I read earlier in the presentation. And that concludes our presentation. We would be happy to take any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? Ms. Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So I'll start just by going through some questions I had on the slides, if that's okay. On slide 10, the tax ranking chart that we did, can you explain to me what the green versus blue, if there's any meaning to that? And did we ever decide to move forward with the real property transfer tax increase? I assume that's what RPT.
Yes, Committee Member Harmon, that is correct. RPT stands for the Real Property Transfer Tax. The items are highlighted in green because those are the items that kind of rose to the top. It's sort of the line that we drew in the sand. If I can go back to the prior slide, which was our methodology to identify which ones were in that sort of upper quartile. Those three kind of were in that area. We have not yet moved forward with a real property transfer tax increase at this time. That is definitely an item for consideration either now or for a later time.
Okay, thank you. This is maybe more of a philosophical question, but it seems to me, just eyeballing this chart, that if we had chosen, say, 3 or 4 of the other options, we could get to what we're anticipating in terms of revenue growth under the sales tax increase. So is there a reason that we decided to, well, I know there is a reason, so I'm asking you to explain what the reason is, why we decided to move forward with the sales tax increase in the first instance versus pushing forward 3 or 4 of these others?
Committee Member Harmon, yeah, thank you for that question. I think it comes down to sort of a lot of it comes down to the what is sort of the political nature of getting voter approval and the appetite for just additional taxes. And so there's a consideration for the people that are going to vote about how many additional taxes might be sort of good candidates for approval, even without understanding how much annual revenue we could receive from them. And so each one of these has a particular consideration. Transient occupancy tax measures typically have a higher voter approval rate. However, they don't generate necessarily as much revenue as a sales tax increase generally. And some of these other ones have a higher sort of barrier for implementation or a larger burden for administering the tax once it is administered. So those are different considerations that our working group evaluated, but they are all candidates and they all should be considered.
Awesome, thank you. So it sounds like sort of purely a mix of pragmatic concerns. Okay, thank you. On slide 20, just a very quick question for our team on the community members that were polled by income level. So for the percentage of sample at the less than $50,000 level, it's 13% of the sample. Was that by chance, or is that based on the anticipated voter turnout for this measure? Or do we anticipate that 13% of the voters of this measure will be in that income category, or was this just purely incidental to the choice?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is Adam from FM3. Hopefully I can step in and answer that. So the survey demographics are expected to mirror the likely voter demographics on a bunch of different factors. So where people live, how old they are, what parties they belong to, whether they're homeowners or renters, et cetera. Income is a little bit of a harder one because we don't have as clear of a standard on the voter file of people's income as we do of their age and how frequently they vote and things like that. So the income may not be precise to these numbers, but we think by sort of having these other demographic factors that we've built into the survey, it's likely that it's near to this, but it's not something that we can be as precise about as some of the other factors.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful and obviously brings up a whole other host of ancillary issues about the challenges of low-income folks getting to the polls. And, I wish this percentage was higher because I think that would give me more confidence in how this was viewed by our community. But thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that all those other markers were utilized. That's really helpful. On slide 29, the community priorities survey results, Adam, maybe this one is for you as well. I was surprised or didn't anticipate seeing protecting local drinking water to be such a high priority on this survey. Can you remind me, when we did this, I think we did this exercise in 2023 as well, was it similarly highly ranked in 2023?
This was actually part of our work, but Adam can certainly.
Oh, sorry, apologies.
No, it's fine. Drinking water actually does tend to test very, very highly in most communities in Southern California. We're blessed to not have a drought at the moment, but we've been through droughts And I think that it's just such an elemental quality. And again, Adam can potentially expand. It's something that every time we have sort of put it forth in the community, people have responded to it.
So, thank you. But that begs the question for me. This was not, this was presented as an option
It
to
was.
respondents. They didn't come up with this themselves.
That is correct. We had found in some of our earlier research that it was a priority issue, so we included it with the others.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And just a couple more questions, not based on the presentation. The first is, clearly housing affordability, it's frankly not as highly reflected in this as I would have expected, but I think you see in the word cloud how important housing is in our community. There's been a lot of discussion around the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and the nexus between that fund and this tax and how the two might play together. So I'm hoping you can speak to where discussions on that issue may be and how the trust fund may or may not fit into this larger conversation.
Yes, Committee Member Harmon would be happy to talk about that. And so we'll actually be talking about it briefly this afternoon during our budget review meeting with the general fund. Currently the local housing trust fund has been funded with general fund money. There was an initial transfer that was put into the fund with prior year surplus. Staff is also proposing to transfer additional funds into the local housing trust fund in fiscal year 2025, which we will talk about this afternoon. Again, general fund sources. And so this measure, as being presented to the committee, would be a general purpose, a general fund tax measure, and so it would be revenue that would come into the general fund, and so it could be a revenue source that could additionally fund the local housing trust fund through the annual budget process. So that is how it could potentially be supported.
So that would be undertaken separately from the ballot measure itself. It's not something that we are contemplating at this point putting in the language of the ballot measure, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yes, Councilmember Harmon, the way that the ballot measure is presented as a general purpose tax, we can't identify specific uses for it because then it would require a different vote.
75,
Yeah, I think it's 2/3 voter
Okay.
approval, and so a general purpose tax just requires the simple majority of 50+1, and so it would be up to the city council through the budget process to allocate specific funds from this to the local housing trust fund.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful, and I would assume that the extent to which we can nail that down would probably help the passage of this measure. That's maybe an aside. And then my final question is, it wasn't really, we didn't go into too much detail in this presentation about what is excluded from this tax, but I'm very interested in that exclusion. So the necessities, and I think you said groceries and medical. So
Pharmaceutical, yes.
pharmaceutical, okay. And we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I want to get it on the record. I'm interested in whether there's been any thought to rethinking or adding additional items in sort of the bucket of what is considered a necessity. And obviously, I'm an interested party in this regard today, but diapers, for example, are essential. And I know other jurisdictions include diapers in that bucket of excluded, or menstrual products, there are so many things I can think. Those are just two that are relevant to my life, but there are so many that I think are necessities. Clothes, for example, though that may be too broad of a category. Have we thought about expanding the necessities list? If we haven't, is that something that we as a council could consider? And what is your view from a financial perspective? I know we're in finance, so the implication of broadening that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Mr. Karinke if he could first respond to the question, then I'll follow up, please.
The state has addressed these issues of women's hygiene products and diapers. I know at least temporarily it was suspended. I believe that those are adjudicated at the state level. And there have been various pieces of legislation trying to tackle both of those. There was at least for a time in which they were both tax exempt. I'm sorry, I don't know if they're still.
If they're not, though, could we exempt them?
I'm not sure that rests within the power of the local agency. I believe that's regulated at the state level. I'm afraid the attorney would have to weigh in on that.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Mr. Henschke.
Honorable Mayor, members of the Mayor, sorry about that. Chair, not Mayor, and members of the Finance Committee. I think you could, because what we're doing is establishing a local transaction use tax, we have a list of exemptions that are currently in the existing transaction and use tax that we have. This would be adding a new chapter that the council would control. Could we add in those exemptions? I think the answer is yes. I need to look into it a little bit further, but we already have a list of things that are exempt from the existing. The proposed ordinance has a list of the same exemptions. Basically, it's a mirror chapter in the code for the additional tax, and that would be something that would be within the council's authority to look at a later time.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll just, and before Mr. DiMartini, I'll turn it over to you, but I would be very interested in our council's advice about that in particular, and also whether we might possibly expand those exemptions for the other measures as well. So obviously, I'm thinking specifically about the sales tax, but to the extent that Measure C has exemptions that are only for food and pharmaceuticals, if we can broaden that as well, I would just be curious about the legality of that. But we don't have to, we can't talk about it now, just.
I can answer the question. What I can say is that with regard to the sales, there's a sales tax that's administered at the state. That's Bradley Burns. Those are set by the state. The transaction and use tax, we have the local authority to do that. We have an existing transaction and use tax that's in our code. You mentioned in Prop C. We have the ability as the council to adjust those because that was adopted by the city council.
Thank you very much.
Committee Member Harmon, I don't have too much to add other than to say that I don't think that the value or the annual amount of like the lost revenue from these exemptions is all that significant from our standpoint as a city. That's the only thing I would add.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few questions, and just to reiterate that pharmaceuticals and groceries would not be taxed by this.
Yes, that is correct, and I would like to ask our Mr. Karanke to confirm that because we have been talking about that. Mr. Karanke, could you confirm, please?
Yes. They are exempt.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple questions in regards, we talked a lot about the revenues today, but one of the questions that comes up is expenditures, and have we controlled our expenditures? And you walked us through Vision 2030 somewhat, but could you, Mr. DiMartini, talk about some of the measures we have taken on the expenditure side to get our expenditures under control, and also what some of those expenditures are and whether or not they are in our control or not?
Yes, Vice Chair Freeman, I'd be happy to talk about that. So we have taken many steps over the past 5 years to work on ways of controlling our expenditures and reducing them wherever possible. One strategy that we have implemented over the past couple of years through our budget process is by identifying specific expenditures to reduce. We have implemented expenditure reductions over the past 5 years, and which is one of the strategies to help us balance our budget. That comes with holding positions vacant. It comes with reducing our materials and supplies and other types of expenditure budgets. We have implemented that for those types of strategies for 5 years in a row. We have also found ways of managing our workforce more effectively. For example, we have consolidated our engineering staff and our project management staff under one structure. They can provide better service to their client departments and have better training and professional development opportunities in this type of structure. We have also implemented a number of technological solutions that help automate, streamline, provide better customer service, provide more electronic type processing, which is going to reduce hours for supporting more manual processes. And then one other way that we've been implementing some expenditure reductions, one of which is out of our control, which was one of your questions, is about our pension costs. We have a really high pension costs that we have to pay CalPERS annually. We also have a very large unfunded liability on our balance sheet because of the amount of future payments we will have to make. Council approved of establishing a pension management policy not too long ago and opening up a Section 115 trust where we put over $2 million into. And I just had our review meeting from the investments in that trust this morning. And I'm happy to report that the rate of return that we achieved on our first quarter is greater than the rate of return on the overall city's portfolio. We made about $91,000 just by investing that money. in that trust. So there are many things that we can do to control our expenditures, and we have done that, and we will continue to do that.
Thank you. And with that, that's great news with the trust. And with the trust, once we put the funding in there, it's in there permanently until we make a payment to CalPERS. It cannot be pulled out as, say, a rainy day fund back into the general fund, correct?
But Vice Chair Freeman, that is correct. We have to use that money for pension-related costs.
So that's a permanent, it's permanent that we put that in there. So just a few more questions. So on the tax itself, we're currently at 8.75. This information is presented at some of the community forums. So if we went up to 9.25, which is the proposal, the half cent, that is the maximum that the sales tax can be, is without special legislation to go higher, correct?
Vice Chair Freeman, that is correct.
And so what would happen if, say, statewide there's another half cent sales tax measure, or in the county, and those pass? And so our sales tax rate would then go up to 9.25 because we would be subject to either one of those. Would there be a difference in terms of the revenue collected into our city with those versus having this this tax measure?
Yes, Councilmember Freeman, thank you for that question. The answer is yes. And so if I may, can I please pull up a slide from our town hall presentation, which might help illustrate the effect of a half cent sales tax rate that we would implement versus if the state or the county would. So this is a slide from the town hall presentation that we presented. And so this slide shows how much of a dollar bill goes towards the state of California for the current 8.75% rate. There's 75 basis points goes to Santa Barbara County, and then we currently, the city gets 2% of the 8.75. 1% of that is the Bradley Burns sales tax rate, and the other 1% is Measure C that the voters approved back in 2017. If this half cent sales tax were approved, this is what the dollar bill would look like. See, the portion of red actually grows. 100% of the half cent sales tax would stay here locally for the city of Santa Barbara. If the county were to adopt a half cent sales tax, or there was some other taxing entity that would limit our ability, we would only receive either a really small portion of that, depending on what the allocation is, or maybe none at all. So it really kind of depends.
So we would, under the proposal that's before us, with the half cent, it's estimated that that 15.6 million would come in, and that would stay here within our city.
Vice Chair Friedman, that is correct. 100% of this potential measure would stay here in the city of Santa Barbara.
And if it went the other way with, say, a state or a county, we could receive nothing, or maybe 1 or 2 million. It would not be 15.6 million.
Councilmember Freeman, that is correct. Again, it depends on how that a potential other tax measure would look like and how it would be structured, but that is generally correct.
And then last question on this, and if we say were to not move this forward or at this time and don't have the tax, and then say a state or a county tax comes in and down the line, we look at that, our finances actually do need to have this, but we're at 9.25% already. Would we even have the option, or what are our options to, again, revisit this if we're already at 9.25?
Yes, Councilmember Freeman, if the rate was already at 9.25 and that was our cap, there is a separate process through the California legislature that we would have to go through to get either an exemption or some approval to go beyond. And I don't have the specifics of that process myself, but we have people here that might be able to provide further detail if you require it.
That's fine. We'd have to get special legislation to even consider this again if there was a tax that came in at the state. And then my last question, this also came up. What are some comparable cities that their sales taxes are any at 9.25, or would we be the only one looking, coastal cities that are similar to ours?
Yes, Vice Chair Freeman, that is actually a slide that we presented during our presentation as well. And Councilmember Hartman, we actually speak to some of the exemptions as well during our public meetings. And so let me just pull up that slide. Give me one moment. Okay. This is a slide we presented during our town halls over the past couple of weeks, and what it shows is a table of our current sales tax rate of 8.75 compared to other cities in Santa Barbara County and also cities in the greater region, San Luis Obispo on here as well, and we're right in line. Carpinteria actually has the highest sales tax rate in Santa Barbara County at 9. What is important to note, though, however, is that we don't typically compare Santa Barbara to some of these cities because they're not full service. They may not have a large tourism industry. So we would typically compare ourselves to other more destination cities like Pasadena, like Santa Monica, like Monterey. And you can see the sales tax rates in those cities are all higher than our current rate of 8.75%. You can see Santa Monica and Pasadena are quite higher at 10.25.
Thank you. And my last question, it's in the staff report just for purposes today. Should this go forward to the recommendation to council, then at the council, what is the vote that would be needed to move it forward to the ballot?
Thank you, Vice Chair Freeman. The vote that is required is a 2/3 approval to move forward for the election.
So that would be 5 out of 7. So, thank you.
Any more questions? No? We're going to move to public comment. Rob Fredericks.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Gutierrez and Finance Committee members. First, I'd like to thank the city team for their outstanding outreach to the community in the previous months and most recently in the past few weeks to inform concerned citizens about Santa Barbara's essential programs and services, as well as the need to adequately fund those essential items. I am also very thankful to the city's leadership and staff for including housing in the conversation of what is essential in Santa Barbara and having the Housing Authority included as panelists during these presentations. During these outreach meetings, I relayed in my presentation that the role of a well-functioning society is to provide, at the very least, basic human needs that allow each member of a community to thrive and live in a manner beneficial to all. And I am grateful that many here understand, as I do, that housing, a home, is a basic human need. Thank you for including affordable housing in this discussion and proposal moving forward. I realize that for some, a sales tax is a very difficult path forward, but the city certainly does need a path given the other measures that have been taken and efficiencies that have been implemented. So thank you for that. The only thing I could possibly suggest as a result of the community meetings, you see that affordable housing was one of the top vote getters, and maybe that is the priority that's listed at the top of the ballot measure. So thank you very much, and thank you again to the city team for including the Housing Authority.
Thank you. We will move on to comments. Councilmember Friedman.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. So first, thank you to all the work that went into this. This is a lot of community meetings. There's been some held in each district, and I was at one of them. Had a really good turnout. And it is a big ask, and it's not easy to go forward with a request for a sales tax, especially in these times. However, we also need to look beyond just today and look at 5-10 years from now where we want the city to be in a lot of ways. And when we look back to 2017, there was similar discussions on Measure C and the infrastructure tax, and we'd fallen behind in our infrastructure for many years, and we are all thankful that the voters voted for it at the time. And I think this tax proposal would be somewhat similar to that down the line, because we took care of the capital infrastructure, but there is pressure now to take care of the human services infrastructure. And you can't have one without the other. And in order to have a thriving community, you need to invest in the capital, but you also need to invest in the people. And everything that's in here, whether it's public safety, libraries, parks, water infrastructure, all that. So I'm going to be supporting moving this forward today to the full council. I think the full council should have the opportunity to discuss it. And I also think we need to give them the opportunity coming out of finance to hear what we have to say and take a vote on it at finance, even if it is split. And I definitely understand reasons for it being split. The last things that I'll say is that with Vision 2030, we are looking over the course throughout this decade of how we can look at both revenues and expenditures. And we're continuing to do that work. It's not stopping, it's ongoing. If we weren't continuing to look at how we can limit our expenditures, we would call it Vision 2024 if we were stopping. But it's Vision 2030, so we're doing that every year, and we're going to continue to do that regardless of what happens with that here, because it's our responsibility to do that. The other thing is that many of those who are in most need of services would be some of the primary beneficiaries of this. Especially, I appreciate our partners with the Housing Authority, because there is no dedicated funding source, and they're very difficult to get into to fund our housing trust fund. This would give us an option to contribute to it, and those would go into Capital A Affordable if we're able to use the local housing trust fund, depending on that, which would really help the community a lot. So there's a lot of services, human services, investing in our public that this would benefit, and we should have a full discussion at the council, and ultimately, my opinion is let the voters decide. So I will move the staff recommendation when the time is appropriate. Thank you.
Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to try to get through this. Sorry. Well, I'm going to ask a little bit for everyone's indulgence here, because I think what you'll hear me say in my comments is just a whole lot of contradiction, and I'm struggling to reconcile some of these things. I guess this is just a moment where multiple things can be true at once, because on the one hand, I believe wholeheartedly that we are in a very difficult position as a city. This is an incredibly important moment for us to think about how to be a fully funded city moving into the future. And I have total and complete confidence in our staff, particularly in our finance director, that this is critical, and critical for the financial future of our community. I believe that. By the same token, though, I really struggle with the idea of a sales tax increase. And I think almost everyone in this room has heard me tell this story before, so sorry, you have to sit through it again. But at its very core, a sales tax of the nature that we are discussing is regressive. It just is. And what does that mean? It means that a sales tax like this is going to hit people with lower incomes harder. Any money that they spend on items that are subject to this tax will make up a larger percentage of their total income as compared to a higher income person. So it is going to have a disproportionately larger impact on our lower income residents. I take the point that a lot of the services that we're talking about funding will be of direct benefit to those residents, but I have to wonder, what kind of city are we building when we tax people on the very services that they need in order to live a safe, productive life in this community? I agree, housing is a human right. I agree that housing is a fundamental responsibility of this city. I struggle with taxing at a disproportionately impactful rate the very people that will need to make use of the housing that is built vis-a-vis this trust fund. So that's an age-old argument about sales tax. This is nothing new to anyone in the room, but I really struggle to square that circle, especially when what we're talking about is human services. I do appreciate, and I will wrap it up, I promised a lot of people in this room I wouldn't turn it into a lecture, and here I go. But I do appreciate that we have thought critically and appear to be open to thinking more critically about what constitutes an exemption from this tax. By the same token, however, the very need for an exemption to me highlights how philosophically I just cannot align myself with the sales tax. Sales tax increase rather. It feels to me in a lot of ways that what we're saying is if you purchase food or, sorry, he doesn't like what I'm saying, but he's going to have to sit through it. If you purchase food or medicine, that's a good purchase. That's an acceptable purchase. That's a moral purchase, or at least a morally neutral purchase. If you are a lower income person, any purchase that is not a necessity is not good, is not morally neutral, is not acceptable to us, such that we're going to tax, let me just see if I can, there we go, such that we're going to tax it at a higher rate. And I personally, I struggle with this idea that a lower income resident should only have fair, equal access to the necessities, and that everything else, we are willing to tax them at a higher, disproportionately impactful rate. To me, that is not in line with the vision for economic justice that I see for our city. Really, what I want us to prioritize is a fiscal policy that centers economic justice, that centers all residents, regardless of socioeconomic status, in regards, yes, to the necessities, but also to all areas of their civic and economic life, not just those things that we up here deem as necessary for life. So, that's sort of like he really interrupted my flow there, but that's kind of my broad strokes where I struggle with this. Again, recognizing and believing that some revenue generating measures are absolutely necessary. For me, because we have not moved forward with the TOT increase, because we have not moved forward with the vacancy tax increase yet, because we have not revised the reserve policies I've been talking about for quite a while, to me, those options should come first before implementing or moving forward to consider implementing a sales tax increase of this nature, even with all of the very good pragmatic reasons that have been articulated by our staff and by Councilmember Friedman. To me, those other options first must be explored before I could support moving forward on this increase. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Herman. I agree with both my colleagues. I agree that we should move it forward to have a larger discussion with council. I strongly agree with all of the comments Ms. Harmon just mentioned. I can't ignore the district that I represent, and the sales tax at this moment in time, I agree that if it would be a better sell if we could focus it on mostly on housing, and I will explain why. We're not functioning at full capacity. We're still functioning like we're still in COVID. There's departments that are not open 5 days a week. There are staff that are not here. They're still working remotely. So we're not giving the public the full service that they deserve. And I understand financially where we're at, and I thank staff for all their work. But because I've had community meetings, and I do want to listen to that larger discussion with council, we have to be very careful on adding another tax to our community members when we are not working at full capacity. That's where I'm at right now. And again, I do understand where we're at financially. I see the cost of, the salary increase and pensions, and I'm a strong believer that we need to pay our city staff properly. But because we are still not at the full capacity, and we're here to serve the public, and my district is definitely going to be hit hard. And just hearing the public out, I did go to the community outreach meetings, and I do want to move it forward to have that larger discussion.
Chair Gutierrez, is there a motion on the floor?
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez, and thank you, Councilmember Harmon. I too agree with everything that was said. It's a tough issue. It's not out there. And I'll just add one thing for me that is the risk of the state or the county coming in and doing a tax down the line too, which would hurt our community ultimately. But aside from, I'd like to move the staff recommendation forward to the council with a recommendation, because I think that's the starting place, and the council can have the discussion on whether or not what they want to do, any changes. So I'll move the staff recommendation, and then separately, if this is okay, Mr. DiMartini, I would like to support Councilmember Harmon's, just as a side direction, not part of the motion, just looking at potential exemptions for essential services and things like that people need. So, yeah, so we can do that. So I'll make the motion to move the staff recommendation forward to full council for deliberation.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm not going to second this. I very much appreciate, and I think Vice Chair Friedman is right. Sending it with a recommendation is preferable. I unfortunately don't support the staff recommendation, so I fully and unequivocally support it going forward to council, but can't vote yes on the motion, though I agree with his reasoning.
I agree with Councilmember Harmon. I would like to move it to council, and I understand the reasons with the recommendation, but I just don't feel comfortable.
Okay, Chair Gutierrez, if I may, I do need some clarification, please. So the motion on the floor from Vice Chair Freeman was to agree to staff's recommendation to move it forward. So I do think we need that motion to be seconded, correct? And we need a second in order to have a vote.
So I would like to propose a substitute motion, because staff recommendation is to recommend that council introduce and subsequently adopt. So that's the part of the recommendation that I am taking issue with. So with respect, I would move a substitute motion that we move this discussion forward to council.
Just a clarification, it's not a substitute because I didn't have a second, so it'd be a motion.
Yes, I will second that. Can we take a vote?
Okay, motion was made by Committee Member Harmon and was seconded by Chair Gutierrez. We'll start with Committee Member Harmon, Vice Chair Freeman,
Yes.
Chair Gutierrez.
Yes.
That motion passes unanimously.
Yes, we conclude the meeting. Thank you.